Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Neda Maria Kaizumi, your host on Beyond the Tech podcast, and today we have Mr. David Riedman, who is a researcher and technologist passionate about the intersection of education, safety, and data-driven insight. With a strong background in AI and technology, he has applied his expertise to address some of the most pressing challenges facing schools and communities. He is the founder of the K-12 School Shooting Database, and an important initiative dedicated to documenting, analyzing, and raising awareness about gun violence in educational settings. His work not only helps inform policy and prevention strategies, but also reflects a deep personal commitment to protecting kids and shaping a school future. Thank you for being with us today, Mr. David.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Well, I shall say this, that the first time I came to learn about you was just searching about the school shooting data, and I found your impressive database. Can you tell us about your background or your career journey, and how did you end up to collecting all this data?
Yeah, this was a completely accidental project. I had worked in the Homeland Security space in the U.S. I got my master's in National Security Affairs at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School in a program that's focused on specifically Homeland Security education. And I was invited back there for a think tank program that was around imagining the future threats to Homeland Security. So what the agency would be doing in 10 and 20 and 30 years. And in the middle of that program, I was sitting in a classroom when the Parkland shooting happened in February 2018. And I thought about Homeland Security and what does Homeland Security mean, and why have we never talked about school shootings as a Homeland Security issue? So I had some ideas around how to take some existing tools for identifying somebody who might be a terrorist threat, and could you make just a really simple kind of checklist that anybody could use in a school to do some preliminary screening and maybe identify somebody who's a risk? And lots of people have good ideas in this space. But what I learned is very few people actually test their ideas and decide how many shootings they'd actually stop. So once this basic checklist was made, I wanted to find out how many school shootings it would have actually prevented. And there wasn't any good information. I contacted the FBI. They didn't have any sort of list or information about all the school shootings. The Secret Service had been involved since Columbine. They didn't have any list or information. So if the Parkland shooting happened in 2018, we didn't know how many shootings had happened at schools that year, or the year before, or the decade before. And when we didn't even know the number, you don't know the who, what, where, when, and why of the incidents. So how do you know if any interventions are making a difference? How do you know if the threat is changing or evolving? Going back to terrorism, it would be like if you said terrorism is a problem, but you never identified who the groups are, how often the attacks happen, and the methods of the attack. You just said this is a problem. So I then started a basic Google spreadsheet where I was just making a list of incidents, and that grew and grew. The first version was 300 incidents. The next was 600 or 700 incidents. And now it's more than 3,000 dating back to the 1960s, with about 300 different variables across a relational database structure.
I think it's a very eye-opening action that you have taken. And we all know in the age of AI, there are two things that are important. First of all is data, which you're obviously doing that. And the second is speed. And I really love the fact that you took action and you actually start doing this. It's not so many people there to do that. But talking about that, you have a PhD on machine learning, if I'm not wrong. So how do you see the connection between all this data and using AI for future?
Yeah, so when this started in 2018, it would have been great, or it might not have turned out as well if ChatGPT and other services were available that could do a lot of scraping and data collection, because this was actually a data set that was assembled pretty much manually. There are a couple different open source databases or lists that exist. Things like Wikipedia has a pretty solid list of incidents. Some newspapers have some different time period lists. There was a Department of Education report in the 90s that had a pretty comprehensive list, but none of them were structured in the same format, and they weren't in a spreadsheet where they could be sortable. So it was moving a lot of hard text and PDF and things, and then hand coding variables. And a lot of these were not variables that could be easily automated, because they're things like the time on the clock doesn't really matter when you're thinking about a shooting in the context of the school day. I don't need to know that it's 9:15 a.m. I need to know that it's when students are arriving at the school, when they're in class, when they're in lunch, when they're at recess, when it's after school, when it's dismissal, when it's a sporting event. So those are all of these manual coded categories. I don't need to just know the address of the school that maybe you could scrape. I want to know, did the shooting happen in a classroom or a hallway or a cafeteria? So almost all of those 300 variables are all things that were hand coded, and a lot of the incidents, everything between the 60s and the 90s, came from newspaper archives, and that was 100% manual, because the platform that I used, you couldn't even cut and paste out of these static images of the newspaper pages. So being before really LLMs became this mainstream tool, this was a very manual, labor intensive project. In the last couple of years, I've made a couple attempts to use different AI tools for pulling the information from news articles. I update it with Google News alerts. But those, unfortunately, the models either take incidents that didn't happen at schools but have school adjacent or related names, or if there's partial information, it will fill in erroneous information in all of the categories that are not listed. So I've tried a couple different versions at a couple times, but still hand coding the data during entry makes the most sense. What's been incredible is the power of ChatGPT and Gemini to analyze the data and complete custom queries on it that used to take a lot of time to answer. Now I can do those, since I have a really clearly structured spreadsheet. As long as I give a well-worded prompt, I can get phenomenal results back.
Wow, it's impressive. And now when you're talking about your data, I'm convinced that we're talking about data quality if it's just hand-coded and you really have gone through that. Have you ever come to the point that you think, okay, maybe there are other data that might be interesting to combine with this current data to find out even more? Like, I was thinking that maybe if there are people who are sitting with a psychological issue, maybe if the weather condition is so warm or a lot of humidity, maybe they just feel that, okay, I'm just frustrated, let me do something stupid. Have you ever thought about other kind of data sources than what you're collecting?
Yes, I've tried to structure the data so that it's really easy to analyze with other data sources. So, for example, every incident has the Latin long for GIS coordinates. So if you have any other geospatial data set, it's really easy to marry those. The same with city, state listed for every incident, a zip code listed for every incident. That makes the combination with so many other data collection efforts by the federal government are organized either around zip code or around geospatial coordinates. So that lets those get married. There's one person a couple of years ago who went through all the incidents and added, there's a standardized school ID number to each one of the incidents. But a problem is that schools open, close, get renamed. So that worked for current incidents, but going back further, there are schools that had shootings that no longer exist, or schools that had a shooting, but now, they've been restructured in some way, so they're not the same over time. So I think one of the challenges with this is the the historical data can be really complicated to marry to different data points around that time. For example, people have asked policy questions about, did the presence of a school police officer change these outcomes, or did the changes in these laws change these outcomes? Well, those are all different time series things that you need to figure out in different places and different states. And unless you know kind of the exact date that something happened and you can do analysis based on that time, then that's been the most complicated types of questions to answer with this.
Wow. And I would like to emphasize again, because our listeners will probably follow up and deep dive more. You're the founder of K-12 School Shooting Database, which is an extremely incredible job, I think, to do social impact. What inspires you in the first place to actually start this? Because not everybody wants to touch the social subjects. It doesn't have so much money. But you have done a great job. So what inspired you first?
I mean, I really didn't plan to do this at all. I was working on a threat assessment checklist and just wanted to be able to see how many shootings the checklist would have identified the perpetrator. And then slowly the spreadsheet of incidents just grew and grew and grew. And then that was when it was clear that this was a much bigger and more pervasive issue than I thought or most people would think. So then it was the interest in trying to uncover as much information that really drove me for a couple of years to keep digging further back into the archives, to keep checking against other data sources, to just keep adding more and more variables to recode something, because there'd be a question that just wasn't being answered. I'd realized when I first did the first round of data entry, that wasn't a variable I coded, and then going back through to make it more robust. One of those questions over and over is, I capture the full scope of gun violence. What people really pay attention to is the deliberately planned attacks. So now I have multiple different variables that I added after the fact around whether it was pre-planned, whether somebody had multiple magazines of ammo, whether the shooting took place in one room or multiple rooms or the hallway or multiple parts around the campus. What type of attack was it? Was it a surprise attack by a student? Was it a kind of military-style frontal assault by a heavily armed person? Or say a sniper attack? Those are all things that I had to go back and code. So it's every time that there's a really interesting research question or something that I realize I haven't explored yet, that's what drives me to go back and keep making this more robust and keep adding, more and more information to it.
You bring me to something interesting now. You have studied the data, and as you said, you have used Gemini and ChatGPT. What kind of pattern have you identified studying all this data? What is your takeaway so far?
There are multiple kind of patterns that have come up that I think are counterintuitive to the public narratives around this. So, for example, when there's a school shooting, I think people imagine that you have, an adult person, some sort of deranged psychotic person in like a combat uniform walking towards the school. And if you can just have an armored entryway that keeps them out, and if you can just have a police officer who can spot them and shoot them, that you're going to be able to prevent the attacks from happening. But once I've coded all of these different variables, so it's a relational database that has the incident details, the details about the shooter in a separate tab connected with a common incident ID, the details about the victims, including where the victims were shot, like the location within the school where they were shot, the details of the weapon, and then the details of the school campus are all separate. Once you start marrying some of those variables, so looking exclusively at planned attacks and the affiliation of the shooter to the school, that shows that almost all school shootings are current students at the school, followed by recently former students at the school. So it's not a scary outsider coming, it's an insider. Then when you continue sorting based on those pre-planned incidents and diving in, most common situation is a surprise attack that starts inside the school. So there's not a warning. There's somebody that has a gun concealed. They often go into the bathroom or they'll pull it out of their backpack inside a classroom. And so your armored door or your security guard at the front door don't make a difference when a surprise attack is starting inside. And then looking at details like, was it a single room, multiple rooms? There's a lot of effort that's being put into fortifying classroom doors, adding all of these countermeasures in hallways, attack drones in hallways, things like that. The majority of the planned attacks begin and end inside the same room. So that further informs your planning, because it doesn't make a difference what you have in the hallway if the attack begins and ends inside the same room. Maybe that armored door is actually helping the person who's committing the attack because it's harder for somebody to get in and stop them. That was the case a couple of years ago in Colorado, where some students locked the classroom door behind them when they started committing the shooting inside. And finally, things like how the incident ended is one of the variables that I code. And when you have these planned attacks, they usually end with either the shooting committing suicide on their own terms. They usually have extra ammo when they do it, being subdued by other staff and students, or fleeing. It's very rare that a police officer ends a school shooting. So that completely changes the narrative and the thoughts and the planning around there, because these are things that are going to happen before, they're going to end before the first police officer even gets to the school. And then finally, I think what really has been a policy piece that I've been trying to use the data to illustrate is when you take all of those factors together, many states in the US, there are 29 states that allow teachers to be armed inside the school. And the thought is that armed teacher is going to somehow stop a school shooting. Well, look at the factors. It's a current student, it's a surprise attack, and it's inside a classroom. It's your most common scenario. So if a teacher is being armed, that means they're being armed to kill a child in their classroom. They're being armed to kill one of their students. And when you frame it in that way, what parent in the world would want a random teacher to be the judge, jury, and executioner of their kid? Because if it's a surprise attack and a kid pulls a gun out of a backpack, if a teacher is in the mode of thinking that day, I've got my gun, maybe we heard something about a threat. When the kid reaches too fast in their backpack, the same thing that happens with police officers every year across the US, do you end up with a teacher killing a kid in the classroom? So that's the type of, I think, data discovery and policy implications and the real harsh reality of these incidents that this kind of information informs.
The study of data has given an incredible insight in what's happening in a school shooting. But I have a follow-up question here. So when you have all this valuable data that you take it to school, how the school is receiving this information? Do they say, okay, well, let's do something with it, or what kind of action they precisely take? The next question that I also want to ask is that, have you ever encountered a question that is this data reliable? How do you know that? So this is kind of two questions I would like to have follow up.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't get a lot of follow-up on how schools are using this data. I have hundreds of emails from school police officers, school administrators about, can I have a copy of this? We're going to use it for training. We're going to use this to look at our policies. But I don't usually hear back from how that data is ultimately used. What I do see, and how I find most of the guests for my podcast, is I also get hundreds of requests from researchers, most often either master's or PhD students or professors working on papers. And so they'll send me a request, I send them the spreadsheet, and then in my Google alerts, a couple months or years later, I'll see a notification that something got published, and I follow back up with them. And then we pretty often I've had 20 or so guests on my podcast who are discussing research that they've done using this data. So that's when I really get to see the outcomes. But I don't know a lot about how the school districts use it. But the number of people that review the data, specifically all of the academic researchers, are one of the best quality control items that I have, because I don't have an automated download. I make sure that every person emails me, and that way I can collaborate with them, I can follow up with them, we can create a dialogue around that. So a researcher might say, I sorted for this and I saw a duplicate entry, or this has the wrong date, or when I mapped this, there's a Michigan incident that's coming up in Minnesota. So that creates a way where, the peer review of an academic paper is usually 2 or 3 random people. I've literally had hundreds of graduate level or PhD or faculty members who have reviewed this data, and many of them give me feedback anytime that they have seen an error or discrepancy or missing incident or so on.
So that brings us that there is no doubting the reliability and data, is just a lack of action actually from the school. Because what I don't like to see, honestly, I think personally, that when you go to school and then you bring all these facts and tell them, okay, this is the pattern, let's do something with it, and then they park the discussion and say, okay, this is a policy issue. I don't think it's purely a policy issue, because people can actually do something actively with it when we have the data. What's your personal view? What do you think?
It's probably a mix of different things. There's been a big problem that, since Columbine in 1999, which, is 25 years ago, there's been a lot of both policy and procedure and action around kind of the securitization of schools in the United States. But if there wasn't any data to inform any of that, and there wasn't any empirical study of any of the policies and procedures, whether it's policy things like zero tolerance discipline, whether it's the action and structure of your threat assessment team, or the physical securitization of the building, all of those things were just based on assumptions. They weren't being tested or based on any evidence. And so that's created a lot of resources that, schools are not a resource-rich environment in the United States. Like, we have some of the most poorly funded school systems in the developed world. And if schools are putting time and effort and funding into programs that don't make a difference, or things related to the building that aren't helping, then it's very hard to kind of capture and quantify exactly what those impacts are. But if you've spent millions of dollars over years adding ballistic windows to all of your buildings, that means that those millions of dollars haven't gone into the new STEM program in the school, or haven't gone into an extra teacher's aide, or maybe the school counselor who would have been able to talk to a student who was in crisis long before it escalated to violence. I think that those impacts are just way too complicated for us to even try to unpack right now.
I'm just curious that what is your personal challenges when you knock at the door in the schools or wherever else? What are the biggest challenges that you encounter?
Well, I don't really knock on the door to schools. I provide the data, and I let people who are interested come and engage with it. And I try to make presentations and have school administrators on my podcast and share as much information with them as possible. Again, like, the United States doesn't have, we don't have a unified education system or public safety system at all. Like, there are thousands of independent school districts all over the United States that fall under different state education departments, and the federal Department of Education, which has been nearly disbanded by the current presidential administration. Even before then, they didn't really have, they don't have direct authority over schools. They just provide mostly funding for rural schools and for schools that provide assistance to students with disabilities. So when we don't have any top-down governance in the United States, it's really hard to push any sort of unified policy towards it. I mean, even thinking about one of the most effective ways to stop school shootings is to have a classmate or a friend or a relative realize that somebody's in crisis, realize that they're talking about violence, and that they are escalating towards thinking that committing violence is the solution to their problem. That's been the pattern with school shootings and mass shootings in public places. We don't have a national threat reporting center. Most states don't even have a state-based reporting center. And there are different nonprofit organizations that run tip lines and things like that. But schools need to opt into it and create an agreement to even be part of it. So when we don't have any sort of comprehensive network, every single preparedness effort is really piecemeal. And I think that that's just our big problem in the U.S. is that we're just a mess of governance between the federal government, the states, and all of these individual independent municipalities.
I kind of agree with you because I'm Norwegian living in Norway and we don't have so much. We don't have school shooting. The most closest one was the one that happened in Sweden earlier this year. And nothing more. And I think one of the reasons is just exactly what you said, this incident reporting, and they're working a lot on the social environment for schools, so students can actually talk to someone freely during the day, even after that if they need. I haven't come to that point that US has such kind of facility for the kids or even for the parents if they need to talk to someone. Maybe that can be one solution. But also, I would like to ask you, what is your personal opinion on the differences between Europe and US? Because the number of mass shooting is totally different when you come to Europe.
Yeah, most of the high fatality, high casualty mass shootings in the US happen in small rural communities in the South and Midwest. And those are some of the poorest communities in the country, and people don't have job opportunities. There's not good health care. Overall, in the United States, we have very poor mental health services. Even if you have health insurance doesn't cover therapy and counseling in most cases. So if you're a middle-class family who's barely getting by and there's a kid who has depression or suicidal ideation and having trouble with attachment or bullying or other situations at school, is that family even going to have $100 or more a week when you maybe have credit card debt already to be able to get a kid into weekly ongoing therapy? That's not free. Most school systems have, the ratio is like 1 to thousands of counselors to students. So even if somebody's having trouble, in most parts of the country, there aren't any real resources to get them help. And I think one of the most tragic things that I've heard is, so after the Uvalde shooting, there were all of these students who were in the classrooms who witnessed this death and carnage and have severe post-traumatic stress disorder. And those are kids that need, daily and weekly counseling for probably years of their life to be able to develop kind of normally after experiencing an incident like that. There aren't any child mental health services anywhere near their region. And the parents have to drive 2 hours to San Antonio to find specialists that they pay out of pocket for. So it's just, we don't give people the things that they need to get help in the United States, and we make it very expensive. And even if somebody does have money, there are very limited people who can really be helping kids and teens who are in crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think personally, besides this project, do you think AI can solve any other problem in the school to make the school a safer place?
Yeah, I think that AI can work in a couple areas. I think it's really scary for people to think about right now, but there's some kind of growing evidence around AI as a counselor or as a therapist. And I think that if that develops and it shows that there are some safeguards, when we have such poor mental health services in the United States, if there was an AI tool that kids could interact with in a positive way, and you could have ongoing therapy, like that may be a pathway beyond just school shootings to help with, the U.S. has depression and teen suicide and substance abuse and online content addiction and tons of issues where if you could have an affordable and constantly accessible AI therapist who wouldn't hallucinate and tell you to kill yourself, then this could be really beneficial. I think the other piece that AI is going to help with is bringing together disparate data to show that there's a problem. So in Georgia last year, there was a school shooting committed by a kid who had been in 5 different school districts and 6 different county level mental health evaluations or police interventions based on threats that he made or statements made online. None of those 11 different local government entities between school districts and police departments and mental health services, none of them knew that anybody else had talked to him. And they all had pieces of a very important picture. And when he showed up for his first week of class at a new school district, they didn't know a thing about him. They didn't know a thing about any of the prior issues that he had. But that's something where an AI evaluation of all of that state level data could quickly piece this together, and your school administrators would say, oh, wait, there's a new student here who has a lot of family and personal and emotional issues. We should probably, do something to kind of help this student. And you might have prevented the school shooting from happening just by having AI be able to pull things together from disparate data sets that no human would have the time or ability to look at.
Absolutely, I agree. And I have a favorite question in this show, which I would like to ask you as well. If you are given the unlimited resources in the world, besides pursuing this project that you have, what else do you want to do by using AI?
So my PhD dissertation, which I just recently defended, is on using large language models to assess school shooting threats. So beyond actual shootings at schools, which happen about 300 times or so every year, there are, in my estimate, about 100,000 threats made to schools every year. Those can be on social media, notes, message boards, phone calls, anonymous reporting apps, all of this different information. And that it wastes so many resources to try to investigate every one of them with a human person or team of humans. It disrupts the school day when you don't know how to assess them well. So you might send police to the school based on a 911 call. You might have classes canceled or have a school go on lockdown because of something that was posted on social media. So we end up spending millions of dollars on police responses and losing millions of hours of education, and then the psychological disruption of when kids go on a lockdown, they think that the shooting's going to happen. And from talking with parents and counselors and others, the school climate is disrupted for days or weeks after unexpected lockdowns and threats and things. I think that based on my defended research now, that AI can assess those threats with the same level of accuracy, but a much lower cost, faster, and lower variance than human decision makers, that I would, with unlimited resources, try to deploy a nationwide system to provide a validated model that can assess threats in every school district.
Wow. I really pray that the resources get to you, that God knows how to find a way. So this is a really brilliant idea. Well, last but not least, I have a question on Beyond the Tech. That's the name of my podcast. But what does Beyond the Tech mean to you personally? A lot of people are thinking about responsible AI. There's a human behind all this technology. But if I tell you what is Beyond the Tech, what would you say?
Beyond the Tech is that each one of these data points is a person and is a life. every one of those tabs every one of the rows in the shooter column was somebody's child, was somebody's friend, but in each one of them something went wrong, where they went from being a regular kid to being somebody that's forever recorded as committing a school shooting. And then the same with the victims, that every one of those victims in the rows is a person that had life-altering consequences of being wounded, or a person who's a kid who never got to grow up because their variable is fatal. And so I think that's the thing that's beyond the tech here, is looking at a national scoped issue for 60 years, having 3,000 incidents and 300 variables and all these data points and time period and this, that ultimately every single one of these things is people. This is not the schedule of deliveries into, fulfillment center. This is a project to record and remember and analyze and learn from some of the worst tragedies that I think we've witnessed as a modern society.
Great. Before we wrap up, I would like to ask, as a founder of K-12 school database, what will be your message to people who are listening to us? What would you encourage them to do?
I think that, this project started because I had what I thought was a good idea and a simple solution to a problem. But then when I wanted to validate my idea, there wasn't good information available. And once I started collecting information, what I thought would be a simple solution, what I thought was a pretty straightforward problem, turned out to be an incredibly complex issue. And when you have a complex issue, there is not any simple solution to it. So I think that the lesson from this is something that we can apply to so many of our biggest problems in society, is if you think something simple and you think that there's a quick way to fix it, you really have to validate that, and you've got to study it. Because if you just throw a random simple solution that's not evidence-based and not validated, then you're either not helping at all, or you're potentially having negative consequences because you're taking away resources from what the real solution might be.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. It has been an incredible conversation, at least very helpful to me, and I'm sure it's very helpful to our listeners as well. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. David Riedman, thank you.
Thank you. Take care.